back to the beginning of it to explain it, but the gist of it is that you have these three men who decided not to worship the statue that the king had set up, and the king is questioning them on why they would be the only ones who don't worship the statue, and still they sort of resisted obeying the king in worshiping the statue. So the punishment is that they are thrown into the fire. In fact, if you rewind a little bit in verse 15, you can see that the king's even trying to persuade them that this is not the best idea. So he says, well, if you worship it, you'll be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? So the king's argument that he has set up is there's nobody here for you. You're by yourself. So you're making the stand by yourself. And once you're in the fire, no one's going to be able to rescue you because there's no rescue from this scenario. No one can come in and intervene for you. So we see that the fire is increased. So when they are thrown into the fire is so hot, it says that even the men that bring them close to the furnace, they die from the heat of the fire. So all three of them are dropped into the fire, and we see that Nebuchadnezzar is the one who notices that there is an extra person in the fire. So he says, weren't there three men we tied up and threw in the fire, just in case he somehow forgot the number of the men? And they said, well, certainly, okay. He said, look, I see four men walking around the fire, unbound and unharmed, and the fourth looks like a son of the gods. So his intent was to punish these three. The punishment is not simply that they're thrown into the fire, but that he has already established to them that you are suffering alone, because no one's going to stand with you. Once you're in this scenario, no one can be there for you. There's only me, the person who's either going to put you in the fire or take you out. So this is between you and me, right? So you can see this as a scenario where there is the enemy and then there's us. So there's nobody else in that conversation. And we think we have to make our bargain and escape with this person. It's sort of like if you were held hostage by one person, you can't rely on people outside of that room because they're not there for you. You have to negotiate with this one particular person who's holding you hostage. So that's the same way that Nebuchadnezzar has set up the system, where he's saying, well, either you're going to do what I say or you're going to go in the fire. There's no other option because there's no third person to intervene in the scenario. Yet when he put them in the fire, he's the one that notices, but there is another person. And I didn't put this person in the fire. That's not part of the group of people. It's not Daniel, for example. Is this unseen guest that I didn't expect, but he's inside the fire with them. So not only are all the bonds that they've been tied with inside the fire gone somehow, so they're walking around unbound and unharmed by the fire. So there were two things they were chained by, which was the chains themselves and the fact they're going into this fire. So there's a fourth person walking with them, and he says it looks like a son of the gods. So the best way to explain this thing, which is not explaining the actual miracle, of course, is rather to say that a lot of times the problems in our life are set up in a way where it's us against the enemy. And the number one attack here in this scenario is, well, you're by yourself. Nobody's with you. No one's going to help you. No one's going to come and intervene for you. So you have to negotiate your way out of this problem. But you can see with the three of these guys that they refused to do what the king's asking them to do. And they were willing to, if necessary, die in the fire, but they would not negotiate with the king and what he wanted them to do. And when they go into the fire, remember, the argument is you're by yourself, and you're going to die there by yourself. Not only do they not die in the fire, which is of course important, we see that somebody, and in many readings of this, they say that this is Jesus before his incarnation, that there is what Nebuchadnezzar himself called the son of the gods that's walking there with him. He didn't put this person in the fire. He didn't allow for this person to come into this fire. Yet he is there walking with them in this scenario. So, sometimes we think since we are in a hostage situation, So we think there is nobody that can help me, and we think also that God follows along those rules. Well, he can't intervene because nobody else can intervene. So he too cannot enter this place. He too cannot help me in this scenario. And you can see when Nebuchadnezzar sees that there is this fourth person, this unseen guest that he did not invite, he calls them outside the fire. Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, servants of the Most High God, so obviously not his servants because they refused to obey his command, come out and come here. So they come out of the fire. But if you notice, he can't summon whoever this angel or God might be. He cannot summon him to come outside of the fire. He could summon the three men he threw into that fire, but he doesn't control God who came down to walk with the three men in the fire, right? Maybe that seems very obvious to say, because after all, the enemy doesn't control God and doesn't tell God what to do. But if you think about how we live our life, for the most part, we have a lot of anxieties and fears that the enemy is going to come and he's going to make a mess of things, he's going to destroy things. So some part of us seems to believe that the enemy can command the situation, and even God himself cannot stop this from occurring. But clearly the story tells you that's not really true. So instead of this being a fight between us and the enemy, there's this third man in the fight. There's this third person in the fight, the one we don't usually pay any attention to. So up till now, we don't see God showing up in the story as he does so vividly here. And even when the three men decided not to obey Nebuchadnezzar, they didn't get some sort of revelation. It's not that Jesus appeared to them and said, I'll come with you in the fire. None of that happened. But once they decided they were not going to listen, which is completely based on the idea that God's going to intervene or God's going to have to do something, and even if he doesn't do anything, I'm serving him. So their understanding of this was, it's not two people in this conversation, there's three. But Nebuchadnezzar's understanding of the conversation was, there's only you and me, and I'm the one in charge. So whatever I want, that's what's going to happen. You don't like it, you still have to do it, right? It's like being the boss of a company. You're pretty sure you're in control of everything that's going on, except, of course, in any workplace, the boss is not always in control. Depends on the work force. Maybe there's a union involved. They have their own negotiating strategies. So just because you're the boss doesn't mean you can control everything that's going on. So it's not within the realm of saying that the enemy is controlling everything that's happening in our life. That's not true. But we're not really making the case for the fact that God does show up. And God is actually there in that story. And we don't really think that this is the case. But if you notice, in this part of the story, not only did God show up in the fire so that they're unharmed and walking around unbound, when Nebuchadnezzar calls them back out, he changes his mind. He calls them back out. He can't call God back out. He can't summon God and tell him what to do. And this is a very important point, because as difficult as our scenarios might be, we might think, well, we are under the foot of the enemy. So whatever the enemy wants to do, he's going to be able to do, and I'm going to lose out. Maybe that would be true if it was just between you and a person, just between you and an employer, or just between you and a situation. If it was only two people in this conflict, perhaps that would be true. Whenever we talk about stories and conflict in literature, we always position it as two sides. So we will say, let's say, it's man versus man. There's only two sides to this. Even if you have a bigger thing than a man, you say it's man versus society. It's still only two sides. We don't make room for conflict where there's more than two things going on. So we don't, in our mind, think, oh, well, this person's fighting with me. I have a problem with him. How am I going to resolve this? We don't let God enter this conversation as the third man. We think he's not even there. Oh, I have to settle this. I have to do this by myself. But here's a great example of not only that Jesus had come and intervened for them, but that Nebuchadnezzar has zero control over what God intends for the life of his children. Even though he's this king of all these provinces, he's not able to control what happens in that scenario. To see another example, let's look at 2 Kings chapter 18. If we could read verse 9 down. Okay, so you can see Israel and Judah are separated into two parts. And the part that is only considered Israel has Samaria. And here comes the king of Assyria, and he conquers them. He wipes them out. So if you look at this scenario, if you were Hezekiah, you'd be very nervous because you're next door. So you were both part of the same nation for a very long time. And here the king of Assyria came. He laid siege to Samaria. So when you lay siege to a city, you build up these walls against it. You basically starve them to death so they can't go outside of the city. And then you come in and take everything that belongs there. So he has done it. He has conquered it. And if you look at the story, you can just imagine it's between the king of Assyria and Samaria. And Samaria lost. But in the written version of the story in the book of Kings, you see that the author says, well, the reason it happened is not what you're thinking. This was not a conflict between the king of Assyria and the king of Samaria. The conflict was between the children of God and God. So there was a third person in the story that they didn't pay attention to. They were supposed to obey the commandments of God. They did not. And because it says they violated this command and didn't listen to any of those commands, now we have the king of Assyria coming against them, and they have been taken over and conquered. So Samaria was taken over because they did not pay attention to the third person in this relationship. You might be very focused on your enemy right now, but you're not paying a lot of attention to that third person in your relationship, which is God. And because of whether things are going well in our relationship with God or poorly in our relationship with God, that's what's affecting the rest of our life. But a lot of times we don't see it that way. We just simply look at our problem and our enemy, and we think it's between me and him. It's between me and this job. It's between me and this person. It's between me and my bank account. But we don't pay any attention to that third component, the most important component of why these things are occurring in our life. Now, Samaria is gone. It's wiped out. And then you can see in verse 13, it says, in the 14th year of King Hezekiah's reign, exactly what he feared comes to pass. Sennacherib, king of Assyria, attacked all the fortified cities of Judah and captured them. So he already wiped out Samaria. So Hezekiah watched him do this. Now he has come to Judah, and he's starting to capture Judah. So Hezekiah, king of Judah, sent this message to the king of Assyria at Lachish. I have done wrong. Withdraw from me, and I will pay whatever you demand of me. So he's asking for a certain kind of ransom, and Hezekiah says, I'm going to give you whatever you want. Just, walk away. Don't come against me. Out of the fear of watching this already happen to Samaria and saying, well, look, I am outmatched. I have to negotiate with the enemy. So he's asking for a set amount. Verse 15, it says, so Hezekiah gave him all the silver that was found in the temple of the Lord and in the treasuries of the royal palace. At this time, Hezekiah, king of Judah, stripped off the gold with which he had covered the doors and the doorposts of the temple of the Lord and gave it to the king of Assyria. So basically what Hezekiah does in this compromise, and we should pay close attention to what we compromise when we want the enemy to make a peace treaty with us. What are the things we give up? And it's not just as simple as Hezekiah put together some money and gave it to him. He stripped things out of the temple of God that he himself had put in there. So earlier in his reign, when in his efforts to be more like his great-grandfather David, he had focused on the temple and worship services and tried to set up the worship of God again. He had put his gold in the temple and overlaid what was already there. He had worked for God and done so for many years. He had done this work. Now when the enemy shows up, in the fear that, he already took Samaria, I'm next. He's coming against me the way he came against Samaria. I'm going to lose. I have to solve this problem. So in that fear, the things he's giving are the things he originally gave to God. He took them all out and tried to appease the enemy with the offerings that he once had given to God. The problem with this, of course, is you're not accounting for God being part of this equation. You think, well, I have to solve my problem. And if I have to solve it by doing plan A or plan B, we make up our own plan. How do I solve it? We don't even ask God or involve God in that decision making. We think this is completely out of that scenario. But the problem is you're trying to appease an enemy that has an undying hunger for the things that belong to you. You know, what is it like to be hungry all the time? And really, we don't know the answer to that, because when we're hungry, we eat and then we're full. But the way that our enemy works, because he's not an average enemy, he's our enemy because we are God's children. So our enemy has an undying hunger. So you could eat and never be full. So you could compromise with this enemy. You could give him the things you once gave to God. You could give him your time. You could give him your maximum effort. You could give him all the prayers once you gave to God. You can turn that into anxieties and give it to the enemy. You could do all those things, and you will notice none of them get you anywhere. It doesn't solve your problem, because you're thinking, well, he already took Samaria. Now I'm next. But he didn't take Samaria because he was strong. He took Samaria because God was part of that equation. And we're discounting this completely when we look around us and say, well, others have failed, I am next. Or I have failed before, this is my second type of failure, it's going to come again. Well, we're discounting the hand of God in that story completely. And now that Hezekiah has given all these things, you would think that he would have perhaps solved his problem, since he gave him whatever he could give him. Let's read verse 18 down a little bit. If you read a little earlier, you can see that it says, the king of Assyria sent his supreme commander, his chief officer, and his field commander with a large army from Lachish to King Hezekiah at Jerusalem. So he gave them everything, and they were still hungry. They came back for more. And now when they came back, you can see that there's a lot of people recording this particular moment of history and how humiliating it is, because you gave everything and the best of your time, the best of your efforts, the best of your children, the best of your money, the best of your talents to this enemy, hoping that that should somehow ensure your success. And then it turns around and the enemy says, give me more. But you have nothing left to give. But the enemy doesn't want to hear that. And now you think, let me go back to the way things used to work. I'm going to pray, right? I didn't try that before. I didn't try that as my first resort. So I'm going to try it now. Now that I've lost everything, I'm going to try praying. And now here is a message given from the king of Assyria to Hezekiah. And he says, well, this is what the great king, the king of Assyria, says. On what are you basing this confidence of yours? Here's the problem. Because we already gave away what once we did for God to the enemy, and now he's holding the best of our efforts that we were willing to hand over to him, because we were afraid that was the only way to compromise and win our life. Now that you've compromised this to appease this enemy with this undying hunger, the enemy's taunts and threats are completely based on the fact that he found a gap in your wall. And you might think the gap is Hezekiah is weak, just like Samaria is weak. That's not the gap. The gap is he found out you were willing to sell this God. As long as he pushed you to the wall, you were willing to trade on this God. Unlike maybe Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who said, well, maybe God will help us. Maybe he won't. But either way, we're not doing this. Whether it works for my favor or not, I'm not compromising. If I have to go into the fire, then I have to go into the fire, but I'm not bowing down to you. I already have a God. I'm not bowing to you. There's only one God. There's a third person already in this equation. This is not a fight between me and you. God's also right here. But Hezekiah didn't do that the first time. So now the king of Assyria's message to Hezekiah is, round two. What are you going to base this confidence on? You weren't that confident before. You gave away the things that you gave to your God, right? So why do you think you're going to win now? Because you didn't win before, even though you gave all those things away. And he says, well, on whom are you depending that you rebel against me? And this is verse 23, if you say to me, we are depending on the Lord our God, isn't he the one whose high places and altars Hezekiah removed, saying to Judah and Jerusalem, you must worship before this altar in Jerusalem? So he has enough knowledge of what Hezekiah has done here to say, yeah, no, all the things that you're saying aren't really true. If you really cared about this God, you wouldn't have already sold him out. So now you have nothing to base your confidence on. Maybe the only thing you had before was that. Now you don't even have that, right? And now because we were willing to hand over to the enemy something very valuable that we had, which belonged to our relationship with God, now it has emboldened him to the point that he thinks that he is God. In fact, he says very clearly, well, this is the great king talking. I don't know about what king you serve, but I'm the one that wins the battles. So I'm the great king, right? It can't be your king. Then your king, your God and your king are what? A beggar type of king? Because they lose all the battles. They're not winning anything. Let's read verse 31 and 32 there. Choose life and not death, is what he said. Sounds like a very positive message. But look how tricky he is about how he's saying this. Because he's telling him, well, look, just make peace with me. Negotiate with me. Just hand over what you have. Because once you do that, then these are the things you get. Every one of you will eat from his own vine and fig tree and drink water from his own cistern until I come and take you to a land like your own, a land of grain and new wine, a land of bread and vineyards. He might as well say a land flowing with milk and honey, because that's what he's trying to say. And, the very easy thing that's important to remember here that the enemy is doing is he's telling you, well, look, you followed God all this time, right? Look how that worked out for you. You're losing. Everybody around you is losing. They already lost. I already conquered all those lands around you, and I came once before and took your stuff. So it doesn't look like it's going to go well for you. In fact, since I'm winning, maybe God's on my side. And maybe God's not with you. So let's be realistic. Following God is self-destructive. You're just destroying your whole life. How old are you now? How long have you done this? So you're just wasting your time doing this because everything from your hand has disappeared. And whatever effort you've made hasn't got you anywhere. How long did it take you to get to a promised land? 40 years? How many people died? Oh, no. That seems like a waste of effort and time, and you're not going to get any of that time back. Look, if you compromise with me, there's an easy road to the same kind of promised land. So what he did is he replaced the promise of God with the promise of men. Oh, you worked so hard to get a promised land, and this is what you got, right? Forget all that. If you compromise with me, I could bring you to a land just like your own. And in case you missed the message, he says, choose life. Don't choose death. Don't be self-destructive. Following this God is only leading you to the grave, right? Like King Nebuchadnezzar says to Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, what? If you don't worship me, you're going in the fire. Why would you do that? It's much easier for you if you worship me. You could choose life. Don't choose death. The way that the enemy's argument is set up is very logical. You have lost a lot already. So far, your track record doesn't speak much for what's coming ahead for you. So why do things the hard way when I could give you the same thing? You want a promised land, right? You want a land with vineyards? You want land with bread? You want a land with honey, olive trees? I have that. So you should compromise with me. If you have any sense, you would say, look, this guy's going to win and I'm going to lose, and you should make sure you understand that the road you're walking on with God is a self-destructive road. It's all very logical. And if you listened carefully to the words of the enemy, as Hezekiah had done before, then you will be fooled by it to think, you're right. I have wasted my time. I should just go with you. Even if it means the end of the promised land, because this is the last holdout, right? Already Samaria is gone. Already parts of Judah are gone. All Hezekiah has to do is give up, and completely Israel and Judah is wiped out. For years that they have spent to get to this promised land, and the years of their history in this land would all be wiped out at one shot. All Hezekiah had to do is say, I give up. And everything is gone. It takes very little to give up the fight that you have done for God so far. Remember, for Judas Iscariot, it only took 30 pieces of silver. It's a small step. It doesn't look like a big deal at all. But in that one moment, you surrender years and years of work, generations and generations of belief. You surrender all those things in one moment because the enemy says there's an easier road than this. You shouldn't bother. And look around you. This is between me and you, right? I'm Goliath, you're David, then you're going to lose because I'm a giant. And there's other giants where I'm from. And you have nobody. And you have no one fighting with you. You're not going to be able to win it. Okay, now Hezekiah decided he's going to do things a little differently this time. So in chapter 19, let's read verse 14 down a little bit. So there's a psalm that says, until I entered the sanctuary of God, and then I understood their final destiny. So there is a realignment that happens when you enter the sanctuary of God, where things start to make a lot more sense than they did before. Now Hezekiah tried it the other way before. He surrendered things he should not have to the king of Assyria. He thought that would solve his problem. He realizes now, mistake. It didn't solve it because this enemy has this undying hunger for the things that belong to me. He's not satisfied with eating one of my talents. He wants all of my talents. He's not satisfied with taking one part of my money. He's going to take all of my money. He's going to take everything I have. If I give him one thing that I have, I shouldn't give him anything. In fact, the king of Assyria is saying this is between me and him, but it isn't actually, because this promised land isn't mine. It belongs to God. So he goes in front of God, he brings this letter in, and I want to emphasize to you how serious this letter is, because to this day, we have very few archaeological records of stories from the Bible, but there is a preserved document for what they call the Lachish letters, which has one of the parts of this where they're pleading with the king of Assyria to leave them alone. That part is still preserved, and you can still see it in some museum somewhere. So it's serious enough that it was recorded down. It was the last fight for Israel to exist as a nation. And they tried the method of pleading with the king, of negotiating with the king, tried to get their freedom. But once Hezekiah realizes, oh no, this guy doesn't want to compromise. He wants to devour everything we have. He wants to make it his. I don't want to do that. So this time he goes in front of God. It says that he went up to the temple of the Lord and spread it out before the Lord. And Hezekiah prayed to the Lord, O Lord, God of Israel, enthroned between the cherubim. Now what Hezekiah is doing in this prayer is he's taking his problem and making it God's problem. So he realigned this whole story in the sanctuary and remembered, oh yeah, there's a third person in this conversation. This is about God. This is God's land. And I'm God's child. And since I'm God's child, he does care what happens to me. I'm not doing this by myself. I'm doing this only because he has done this. So if that's the case, then I need him to help me so that everyone knows that this is God's nation. And ultimately, it's important to look at this prayer for another reason, which is one of the reasons that we give up quite often is because we tell ourselves, oh, well, nobody's going to fight with me. Nobody's going to help me. I'm doing this by myself. And once we decide, oh, I'm doing it by myself, we think, well, then I'm going to give up because I'm losing. If this is a fight between a bigger enemy and me, there's only two people in this fight, I'm the weaker one and I'm losing, then I have to give up. But once you realign the prayer and realign your problem in the sanctuary of God, and God enters the story, things will look a little different this time. Now you have somebody who is equipped to handle this fight, and you've done all this work so far. You've given God all this work so far. Why now would you decide to give up on what you have done all this time completely? Now, you can see how the story ends. I think we already know this. Let's read 32 to 36 here. So the message that comes to Hezekiah, because of his prayer to God, because he involved God in his problem, because he redirected his anxiety towards the king of Assyria, towards the prayer to God. Now God is telling him, yeah, this guy's not coming in here. He's not going to be able to put an arrow in the city. He's not going to be able to put his hand on the city. He can't build a siege ramp against the city. And like I told you, you build a siege ramp because you're going to box people into the situation. You're stuck here, and you will starve to death here. That's the purpose of a siege ramp. So once it is built, it's going to take some time, but it's guaranteeing the victory of the invading army, because you will die with no food. It's a very easy system. You just wait them out. And the way that the enemy wins his battles against us is he lays up these siege ramps and tells us, well, there's no escape. You have no way to get out of this. You're just going to starve to death, stuck in this problem. But of course, that is not accounting for God being inside the problem with you. Because if God was there, it doesn't matter that the enemy built a siege ramp. He can't enter the city. He can't touch the things that belong to God, but he doesn't know about all that. As far as the king of Assyria is concerned, it's between him and Hezekiah Hezekiah, he's a weakling. I'm very easily going to beat him. I've beaten so many other nations and so many other gods up till this point. What's another king? I'm going to beat you for sure. So overnight, a surety of victory. If you look at the situation, you can see that the enemy is well equipped in your life. It looks very, very likely that he will win over you. This is not 50-50. If you look at it realistically, it looks very likely that he will win and you will lose. And if you doubt that, no doubt somebody in your life will remind you of that fact. Oh, doesn't it look really bad? Oh, that looks like a real problem. This looks like a real issue. Don't take that defeat. Do what Hezekiah did when he was in this situation. And he tells the people in his country and the people sitting on the wall listening, don't give your ear to this guy. Don't listen to his words, because this is God's fight. And you see right after that, it says, that night the angel of the Lord went out and put to death 185,000 men in the Assyrian camp. When the people got up the next morning, there were all the dead bodies. So Sennacherib, king of Assyria, broke camp and withdrew. Overnight, 185,000 men died. Overnight, so what's that, like 8 hours? In 8 hours, a story that was 99.9% guaranteed victory turned into certain defeat. Because God showed up and wiped out their certainty completely. And he made it very clear that he did that because he was fighting for his children. Now, why would God fight for somebody else's children, right? If you're in your problem and you never call on God because you think this is just about you and your enemy, well, why would God show up? You never asked him to. You think you can handle this, and you're willing to give the enemy one thing after another. All that's happening is you're getting bankrupted, and the enemy keeps eating your things. And he's guaranteed victory over this because you never evoked the third person in the story. When you play video games, for example, I never really played them. My brothers used to play them. So you can play, one person can play the video game, or you could have two people playing where you face each other. Now you can have 3 or 4 people playing depending on the game. Sometimes, if it's a game where you need a team, you have to have multiple players working together against one enemy. So the more people you have, the better things will look for you, right? So when the people enter the game, on the video console, it would always say, player 2 has entered the game. Player 3 has entered the game, right? And when you see that, you feel a little more confident. Oh, good. Someone else is coming in. I'm good now. Everything will be fine. I don't have to do this by myself. And that's literally the scenario I want you to think about. You're not doing this by yourself. If you're working for God, what makes you think you're doing this by yourself? That's his fight. You just have to remind him and remind yourself, really, that he is the one who has to intervene for you. Of course, you can't beat this enemy. He's bigger than you, and he has won many more battles before you. But don't let the enemy convince you that this is only between you and him. No, it isn't. Because this is God's fight, and he can show up to change the situation. Let's look at Isaiah chapter 6. And let's read verse 1 down a little bit. So you can see this is a story about Isaiah. And Isaiah was a prophet who used to work for the king. It's like having a government job before a government shutdown. So he worked for the king. Everything is good. You're guaranteed your paycheck. You're guaranteed your food. Then the king died. Now what's going to happen to you? Now what's your life going to be? And now you think everything's over. I had plans. I had things that I was thinking about doing. It didn't work out. Now what's going to happen? But that exact moment is when he has this vision about what's going on up in heaven. And in heaven there's a king, and that's God. And you see that God's train, which is basically part of your robe, what you're wearing, it is filling the temple completely. So usually, you know, if, for example, in a wedding, if a bride has a train, there are bridesmaids that hold the train for you because otherwise you can't walk, right? You have people who need to hold it for the king or the queen or the bride or whatever it might be. In this scenario, we can see that's not the case, but that God's train of the robe is filling the temple completely. So there's no emptiness or lack here. There's nothing missing here. This is not a story of something where you can see working for God means you lost something. In this temple of God, in this royal court, unlike the royal court where Isaiah basically just got fired from, there's no emptiness. There's nothing missing. You know, a lot of times we tell ourselves that because I did things for God, that's why I'm suffering. I'm missing something, things are not working out for me. That's because I did this thing for God. But you have to ask yourself where that argument came from. Because if you knew what was going on with God, if you were attuned to what was happening in the presence of God, you would know there's no lack in working with God. Anywhere there was something missing, he has something for you. There's never a time where you have to suffer because he wants you to suffer and leave you empty. He's not an employer that doesn't pay his employees. He's not depriving you of certain things, but the enemy is trying to convince you because you serve him, you're missing stuff. No. We are missing things because we were willing to negotiate with the enemy and we forgot why we were serving this God. Now, you can see that in that temple, there are these angels, these seraphs, and they have 6 wings. But this is a weird kind of situation because even though they have 6 wings, with 2 wings they're covering their faces, and with 2 wings they're covering their feet, and with 2 they're flying. So effectively they're blind and they're lame and they have to fly. But you know, when you fly, you have to see, right? But they're covering their eyes. So how can they see where they're going? You know, and this is a great metaphor for how it is to live the Christian life. Because yes, you're not walking, you're flying. But you don't know where you're going. So it seems like you're disabled somehow. And the enemy will often remind you you're lame and you can't see. You did this to yourself. You could have a better life where you don't have to be lame. You can walk with your feet. But why walk when you can fly? That's the part he leaves out. You will never be anything extraordinary. You will just be like everybody else, living and dying this very small, finite life. And God wants you to fly. He wants you to be better than all that. But you can see that these angels are flying, but they can't see where they're going. So how do they know where they're going? So you see verse 3, it says, and they were calling to one another, holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. The whole earth is full of his glory. You know how dolphins talk to each other in the water? It's called echolocation, right? So it's like sonar, basically. So they're calling to each other in the water. The water is transmitting the sound to each other. And the way this works is not simply communication, but it also lets you know location. So if someone is speaking from that corner of the room, even if I cannot see the person, I can hear that the sound comes from there, right? So I know that person is over there. If someone's speaking right here next to me, I know the person's right here, even if I cannot see, because the sound is coming from right next to me, right? The way that these angels are communicating to each other is not simply just that they are engaged in this act of prayer and worshiping God, which is true, but that is effectively working to help them figure out where they are going when they're flying. Why is this important? Perhaps you're thinking it's not important, but it's very important. All of us are flying because we are Christians and we're moving by faith. But many of us are flying blind. We are knocking into things. We are not going in the direction we should be. We are turned backwards when we should be forward. We are compromising with the enemy when we are Christians. And maybe you have asked yourself, why am I so messed up if I'm supposed to be a child of God? Because we're missing this echolocation, right? Which is, we're not using our prayer to communicate with God so we know which direction to go in. Because the angels are talking to each other, the same thing they keep saying over and over again, which is worshiping God, right? The whole earth is full of His glory. Holy, holy, holy is the Lord Almighty. Because they're talking to each other, they know which location the other one is in. They know which way to fly. Even though their eyes are covered by wings, even though their feet are covered by wings, so they have no other option but to fly, they know where they are going. If we think we're Christians, but we don't speak to God because we're angry with Him, because things are not working the way we wanted to, because we don't want Him involved in our life, then we might have wings, but we're not flying in the right direction. It's impossible for us to do this because we don't talk to each other. We are not talking to God. So we're not using the skill we need to move forward with the talents He has given us in the first place. And this is a very important part of progressing in the Christian life, and one of the most difficult ones perhaps, because we could have all this and not be successful because we, like Isaiah, were living our life. And all of a sudden, the rug got snatched out under his feet. This king died. Now what am I going to do? And if you look at the scenario, verse 4, the doorpost and the threshold shook, and the temple was filled with smoke. This seems like chaos. It sounds almost like the whole building is falling down, right? Because they're praying and worshiping, and the smoke filled the temple of God up in heaven. This looks like a place of chaos. Everything is shaking. You know, that's another reason we don't want to do this. Because when you're following God and you can't see and you can't use your feet, it's kind of scary. Because you don't know how to predict what's coming up next. You don't know how to handle what's going to happen next. Because you don't really know what could happen next. And so easier for us to sit in the palace and work for the king and collect our pension. It's easier for us to do what everybody else does, even if we are people capable of better things than this. It's easier for us not to see God at all. And, you know, very often, if you see the smoke that's all through this temple, you know, when there's smoke, you can't see well. Sometimes our issue is it's very hard for us to see God with all the problems that are clouding our mind. Even if we enter the temple of God, there's smoke. Things are surrounding us all the time. It's hard for us to focus and see God for real because we're so focused on our problem. We don't acknowledge that He's part of the story. We're just so focused on us and the enemy. That's it. We spend a lot of time on that. And we have two wings that are helping us fly, but our whole question is always, well, but I have 6 wings. Why can't I have all 6 wings? Why can't everything work the way I want it to work? And if you notice in this whole worship scenario, nobody says anything to Isaiah. They don't even acknowledge that he's there. Yet in verse 5, you can see that Isaiah says, "Woe to me, I'm ruined. I'm a man of unclean lips. I live among a people of unclean lips, and my eyes have seen the King, the Lord Almighty." He has been a prophet for how many years? But until the king died and he got this revelation from God, Isaiah wasn't really serving God the way he could have been serving. Everything you read in the book of Isaiah comes after that moment in history. the revelations that he got, and the person that he should have been. There's who we could be, and then there's who we are right now. And they're not always the same thing. So you can see that the angels then come over to him with the coal to cleanse him. And then he hears a voice of the Lord saying, "Whom shall I send, and who will go for us?" Now God's asking the question. But only somebody in the presence of God would hear the question. And if you already have a day job, you're not going to pick up a second job. If you already have something set for you, and you already have a life planned out for yourself, and God was never part of that story, when God says, "Who wants to do this?" You guys don't understand this. Let me give you my perfect example of this, because I see this every day. I'll ask a question in class. All right, so what's the answer to this? Silence. Anybody? They have to raise their hand. Nobody raised their hand. So I wait, because they tell you to have wait time. Wait for them to think. Finally, someone will raise their hand. I'm like, finally, somebody has an answer. What do you think the answer is? Can I go to the bathroom? So nobody's involved, huh? Nobody's participating, right? Okay, I guess I have to answer my own question. I could just do this by myself up here, right? Maybe one or two kids eventually take pity on me and try to answer the question, right? But the majority of people will just sit there like, you tell me what to think, okay? Don't make me do the work. You just tell me the information. That's not just the students in my room. That's every one of us all the time. We want everything given to us in our hand by God. And he's telling you, well, who's going to go for me? And you're looking around like, is he talking to me? There's a guy over there. Ask him. He doesn't have a job. He could do it. I have to work, and I have a family, and I have 4 kids, and I have 5 bills. Not me. But since Isaiah is now unemployed, since he has nothing to do with his life, since all of a sudden everything is realigned and he's seeing things the way they really are and who he should be, then he eagerly volunteers, okay, send me. I'll go. Even though God didn't say, Isaiah, you want to go? He just said, who's going to go? So you have to volunteer yourself. If that's what you want to do, you have to volunteer yourself to enter this conversation with God. If you want to do this work, you don't have to. You don't have to do any of this because it's rough to do this work. And in fact, what he tells him is like, okay, send me. All right, here's your message. Ready? Okay, go tell the people. Be ever hearing, but never understanding. Be ever seeing, but never perceiving. Make the heart of this people calloused, make their eyes dull. Close their eyes. Otherwise, they may see with their eyes and hear with their ears and understand with their hearts and turn and be healed. So he basically told them, all right, go out and speak, right? But nobody wants to hear what you have to say. Go out and tell them my message, okay? Nobody's going to listen to you. Ready? You ready to go, right? Okay, go. Go tell them. No one's going to want to hear anything you have to say. Because it's hard for them to leave their scenario where it's between them and the world and listen to you. And you're so used to years of working for the king, wearing his badge on your shoulder. Like if you worked in the White House, for example, you get a little badge, right? You're an important person because you work in the White House. And it doesn't matter who you are, whether you're smart or whether you have ability or whatever. You work there, people want to hear what you have to say, right? But take that badge off. Go into the world. Now talk to people. See if they care about your opinion. See if they care about your message. Nobody cares, right? No one cares. You're working for God and you're doing this great work and you think, well, God, where's my reward? How come people are not lined up to get something? How come they're not coming to take things from me? If you're working for God, even if you have 6 wings, you're only using 2. And a lot of times you don't see where you're going. You can't use your feet. You have to do things on a level other people are not doing. You have to understand this isn't going to work like it used to. There was a way your life was. Now, a third person has entered the game. Things are a little different. Now, the most obvious example of this, we'll read the last story. Let's look at Luke chapter 24. Okay, so this is after Jesus has died. He is resurrected, but we still have most of the disciples not really believing any of this. And here's two people. They are going to a place called Emmaus, which is outside of Jerusalem. In fact, Jesus had told his disciples, wait in Jerusalem until you get the Holy Spirit. But these guys are leaving. They've already given up. They've already decided this isn't going to work out. Jesus died. I saw him die. Things are not going to work. They're running away because they see no return or success in this scenario. You know, things can be rough when you are walking with God. There are times where you're not getting an easy confirmation, an easy answer, a solution to your problem. And any human being, if a king can give up and hand over his work to the work of the enemy, why not us? We give up too. And we walk away. And as they're walking away, we see there's two of them. Third person has entered the game. Jesus shows up. He comes up himself, and he's walking along with them. But it says they were kept from recognizing him. So not only that they're blocked because maybe they're not ready to have Jesus enter this conversation, but Jesus himself has stopped them from recognizing his work in this moment. He's this third person who's entered this conversation. And if you question whether God really cares about your life, I just want to point out to you that Jesus, who resurrected from the dead and who should be going back up to meet his Father in heaven, is right now in the story walking with two men on a road to nowhere. Why should the God who created this universe waste his time on this trip with you? He knows where you're going is going to get you nowhere. He knows this is not the way. You had to go back and stay where he told you to stay because he wanted to give you something so you could be extraordinary, so you could fly and not walk, so you could be the people who would change this world. But you're leaving. You're quitting. You're saying this isn't for you. And you're giving up. And you know, there are times that we do this kind of thing, even though Jesus could say, all right, forget these guys. This happened and then that happened. And then some people are saying he came back from the dead, right? All these things occurred. You know, I did say this is a road to nowhere. But since Jesus is walking with them, this road that's supposed to go nowhere all of a sudden has some purpose and meaning. And what I mean by that is verse 25, Jesus says to them, how foolish you are and how slow of heart to believe all of the prophets have spoken. Did not the Christ have to suffer these things and then enter his glory? And beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Originally, this road was going nowhere. Then Jesus showed up and entered this journey with them. They don't know who Jesus is. They don't recognize Jesus right now. They're still caught up in their problem. They have not allowed for that third man to enter the story. But along the way, Jesus is changing the purpose of where they're going. He didn't do that by stopping them. He didn't do that by turning them around. He did that by explaining to them, well, look, you got this all wrong. You understood this completely incorrectly. Even though this is the case, but look, there is something you're missing in here. There's a purpose to why things have occurred. God has not written himself out of your story. So when Jesus entered your life, all of a sudden things have purpose and meaning. Things connect. Eyes start opening. You don't think this is occurring, right? You don't believe me when I'm saying this to you right now. But wait. When he goes and they get to the village where they're going, Jesus acted as if he were going farther. So we can assume he's doing this to see what will they do. Will they say, okay, see you later? Or are they going to tell Jesus, come with us, right? So they urged him strongly, stay with us. For it's nearly evening, the day's almost over. So he went in to stay with them. So their act of trust, just like Hezekiah taking the letter to God, is saying, oh wait, there's a third person in this game. There is a third player in this game. There's a third man here. It's not just between me and my problem. God's here. Okay, I want God. I want him to stay with me. And it says, when he was at the table with them, he took bread, gave thanks, broke it, and began to give it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he disappeared from their sight. Why did that happen? You know, Jesus resurrected. And now you have to choose whether you want him to stay with you or not. Okay?
Because if he stays with you, this is an inconvenience because things are rough when you have an extra person to take care of, right? Someone's in your house, someone's using your stuff. Things are a little difficult. But when he breaks the bread, all of a sudden, something flips, a switch flips, and they say, oh, that's Jesus. Why? It's just breaking bread. Everybody does it. You sit at the table, you eat food, right? Except when Jesus is breaking bread, they're not just eating, everyone eating their own piece of bread. The person breaking the bread will break it off and give it to the other people sitting at the table. That's how they used to eat. It was a communal thing. So when Jesus is doing this, the reason they recognize him is because only God would include you in his life even though you don't include him in yours. Only God would do it. Nobody in this world would do it. Nobody in this world would make an effort for you if you don't make it for them. But God is willing to chase you on a journey to nowhere to get you to understand the purpose of where you're going. God is willing to take his bread and hand it over to you. He's willing to invest himself in you even when you don't want to invest yourself in him. And, here's the thing. Most of the time, God is invisible to us, but we're not invisible to him. He knows exactly where we are, what we're doing, where we're going. In the book of Isaiah, it says that he has carved us on the palms of his hands. It's that important to him that you know that he is well aware of who you are and where your life is taking you, right? My students, a lot of them have a state exam coming up. And I was very stressed about it. They were not at all stressed about it. So they're just taking it easy. Finally, I give them this list. It's basically just everything summarized together to study. And I tell them, go home and read this and make sure you learn it. And one of them's like, that's a lot of work. You know what I'm going to do? I mean, he's joking, but nonetheless. He's like, I'm going to make a temporary tattoo. Just put this on my hand, right? So put it on my hand. When I come in on the test, I'll just look at it so I can do my test, right? No, you can't do that. That's cheating. Okay, but I'm just going to put it because that way it's always right there and I can see it, right? And this is very important. So he sees that it's very important for him that he knows this, but he doesn't want to have to learn it. He wants to put it right there so he can always look at it and know it's there so he can do this test. Okay? Similarly, we're in this scenario where we can make a choice. I'm going to do this. I'm going to leave. I'm just going to walk away from all of that. But don't think that God has walked away from you. He gave you something and you're not paying attention to it. Sometimes we need something sort of right there to say, oh yeah, I did walk on this path before. Things are making sense this way before. And in fact, when Jesus disappears, the two men ask each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and opened the scriptures to us? This is what I was talking about earlier. You might think that while God is dead in your life and defeated in your life, and you're convinced there is no God, in that time you might think, oh, God's not working. But the way he's working is not what you think. Because while Jesus was walking with them, the whole time he was speaking, it says they were saying to each other, wasn't this happening? Wasn't your heart burning with what he was saying? It was working, right? It was working that whole time, right? You knew that your faith was developing as you were walking away from Jerusalem. Because when they woke up the next day, they went right back. They walked all the way back. This time, Jesus didn't walk with them. He walked with them when they were leaving. But this time on the way back, he doesn't need to walk with them because the word that he put in them is walking with them back, right? He's not dead or defeated in their life now. What I wanted you to do with that story is understand that there is a third person in this conversation. Most of the time, the reason we are so defeated is we don't see Jesus as the third person in our life. We don't even see him at all. We're only focused on our problem and our situation, and because of that, we are tired and defeated and depressed, and we don't want to keep going, and we want to quit. And the enemy is here to remind you, you should quit. You should quit. I could give you what God gives you. You don't have to work so hard. You just give it up. This is not important. This is not worth your time. That's incorrect. If you're doing this for God and you have done so far, even if sometimes you compromise on things you shouldn't have, It's worth your time to keep going because God's walking with you. And the things you can't fight, even if you think it seems so certain the enemy is going to win, he could change that story tomorrow. He can work that for you if you remember that he's the third person in your conversation. May God bless you with these words.